This hour on I24NEWS, after meeting with Kim Jong-un's right-hand man at the White House, President Trump now says the June 12th summit with North Korea will go on as scheduled.
The relationships are building, and that's a very positive thing.
The U.S. has vetoed a UN resolution protecting the Palestinians because it did not include the term Hamas and was considered too one-sided.
In Italy and Spain, leadership transitions are finally underway following weeks of uncertainty and economic turmoil.
And this man told everyone he was British and a royal expert. Media organizations interviewed him during the royal wedding, but it turns out he is American and was pulling off a scam.
From the I24NEWS studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Shuster and Tal Heinrich.
The evolving relationship between the United States and North Korea has taken another dramatic turn. President Trump says his June 12th summit in Singapore with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been reinstated.
The president announced the development following a 2-hour meeting in the Oval Office with a group of high-ranking delegates from North Korea. The visit marked only the second time in history that a top North Korean official visited the White House. Correspondent Serena Marshall reports.
It's official. President Trump declaring the Singapore nuclear summit with North Korea is back on.
You people are going to have to travel because you'll be in Singapore on June 12th.
The declaration followed his receipt of a letter from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, hand-delivered by his top envoy. The letter had to be inspected by U.S. officials before reaching President Trump's hands.
Really, this was a letter presentation that ended up being a 2-hour conversation.
In total, they met for an hour and 20 minutes. The visit began with black U.S. government vehicles pulling up to the residence. The former North Korean spy and Kim Jong-un's top negotiator for talks, Kim Yong-chol, greeted by Chief of Staff John Kelly. No sign of the president as the group walked along the Rose Garden colonnade, making their way into the Oval Office. A window, the only glimpse inside. Secretary Pompeo seen nodding along, Chief of Staff John Kelly pacing. Friday afternoon, as they all emerged, the president escorting him to his vehicles, continuing the conversation flanked by translators, before stopping to pose for photos.
And it's a process. It doesn't go, we're not going to go in and sign something on June 12th. I think we're going to have a relationship, and it'll start on June 12th.
Thursday, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un reaffirmed he is committed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, according to state media, but expressed hope for a phased-out process.
And that was Serena Marshall reporting. Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv to discuss it further. Dan, has President Trump now revealed what the topics of the historic meeting in Singapore will be?
We heard about a few, and first let's start with denuclearization. For U.S. officials, that means North Korea has to give up its nuclear weapons. For the North Koreans, it actually includes a demand that the United States military not have any nuclear bombs or missiles in all of Asia. Call that a maximalist demand that President Trump almost surely would refuse. Now, the United States is also willing to talk about prosperity for North Korea after a deal is struck. President Trump said that would not be expensive for the U.S. because it would be financed, in a sense, by countries like South Korea, Japan, and China, I guess through trade and investment. What about human rights abuses in North Korea? A reporter asked that, and President Trump said no, it didn't come up, and apparently he doesn't plan to raise that issue. And here's another interesting point of, I'd say, politeness toward North Korea. In that meeting in the Oval Office, there was no Vice President Mike Pence and no National Security Advisor John Bolton. They ordinarily would be there, but they've been saying very hawkish things about North Korea, so they weren't there. David and Tal.
Dan, what was the overall mood at the White House on this day? I mean, it's so intriguing to see these pictures of the North Korean delegation led by their former spy master walking along the colonnade and heading into the Oval Office.
A lot of people thought it was amazing, and by the way, there was a brief stop inside the White House itself, or if you will, the connection to the West Wing, probably for security reasons. That's right, nothing is being revealed about what the Secret Service did, but these were representatives of, well, practically an enemy country, right? The Korean War is not officially over. There's a record of assassinations. Even this visitor, the #2 man in North Korea, there are U.S. sanctions against him for alleged links with violence and terrorism. So whatever the Secret Service did, using a magnetic metal detector or searching them, we don't know. Again, everything is being very, very polite. But just to see a North Korean senior official going in there for what we thought might be a 10-minute meeting just to hand over the letter, they chatted for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and Trump thought it was so impressive that he kept saying it was 2 hours. He was proud of speaking so openly and for a long time with his visitors, David and Tal.
So lucky to have you there with the timer, Dan Raviv. One other thing, when the president then flew by Camp David for the weekend, we noticed the First Lady was not with him. So who was there? And what do we know about Melania Trump at this point? Is she still ill?
Yeah, 18 days ago, she was hospitalized at a military medical center for treatment of what was called a benign kidney condition. Not many details were given. She did go home to the White House in less than a week, but she hasn't been seen for over 3 weeks. Now, Melania Trump tweeted this week from the official First Lady account that she's feeling great with her family, working hard for children and the American people. But on the helicopter, Marine One, going to the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, Camp David, no Melania Trump. However, the president's adult children, except for Eric, they were there. Donald Jr., Tiffany, Ivanka Trump with her husband, Jared Kushner. Trump told reporters he'd be doing a lot of work this weekend on the phone to the leaders of other countries. He said he's negotiating trade deals. David and Tal.
Dan Raviv, thank you.
To discuss all things North Korea, let's bring international security analyst Martin Himmel joins us in studio. And Martin, the body language was intriguing to see Kim Jong-chul. What did you read into it?
Well, you've got to go back maybe 400 or 500 years into Korean history, where basically it's warlords and emperors that we're talking about. And I've had this conversation with North Koreans, and I could see this vice chairman coming in and think he's coming to see the world's biggest emperor, and what an honor it is to be there, even though he's a big enemy. And I'm sure Donald Trump looked at it differently. A lot of ratings, a lot of exposure. I'm hitting my critics hard. But from the North Korean side, it was a big moment of self-respect that was enhanced for them. When you're greeted by a big emperor, your self-respect is going up, and that will play a very important point in their negotiations.
So we don't really know what was in that letter that was delivered to President Trump. We're not sure that the president has read the letter himself, right, David?
Yeah, I mean, that was so interesting, because at first he said it was a delightful letter, and then a few minutes later he said, well, I haven't read it yet. So how do you know it's delightful?
Right, but maybe Martin here has a clue, because the president seemed to be delighted. There's a lot of, positive rhetoric right now. How are you reading these signs?
Listen, I'm sure he knew about it before today with email and everything else. I'm sure he knew everything that was in there. It's the gesture that counts. Again, go back 400 or 500 years. Some emissary gets with horse and wagons and ships and goes thousands of miles or 100 miles, sees a big emperor, and brings a personal message from his emperor or his king. It's a very big gesture. And I'm sure it would be something that would show some sort of encouragement to go to these talks. So it's a grand gesture. It's an important gesture for the North Koreans, maybe more important for them than for Donald Trump. But personally for Donald Trump, it's ratings, exposure. Here I am, a world leader.
As far as the June 12th summit is concerned, President Trump seemed to lower expectations. He said this was just the start of the process, that they would likely not even sign anything. Is that normal for a summit meeting between heads of state?
Well, he's sort of putting the cart before the horse, but he does everything in a rather unorthodox way. Usually people build towards a summit where there's something concrete concluded and there's a big success. Something will be concluded here, something maybe break up into negotiating platforms, etc. But let's look at history. The Clinton administration thought it had a deal worked out with Kim Il-sung, Kim's father, to not even get nuclear weapons. And what are we talking about now? We're talking about trying to denuclearize. He's got hydrogen bombs. He's got atom bombs. So, agreements that are signed don't necessarily mean much with North Korea. It's a long road, and trust will not be easy. The North Koreans also don't trust the Americans. They saw the United States sign a deal with Libya that would have given Gaddafi safeguard, but if he denuclearized, and, well, we saw what happened to Gaddafi. He was shot on the streets, and partly because American weapons destroyed his army when he was trying to quash a rebellion.
Martin, if we look back at the Iran nuclear deal negotiations, we see on one side a strong alliance between 6 countries, including the United States. And here we see with North Korea, basically the United States, and the way the president put it out today, he said China, but more accurately, South Korea and Japan are involved, but they're not really a part of it, right? How do you see this going? Should it be an alliance?
Only in front of the camera, not part of it. They are a huge part of it. Nothing can happen without China, first of all. When When you're in North Korea, the only people who go in and out of North Korea easily without any safeguards are the Chinese. They come in, they go to hotels there, they gamble, they leave their dollars there, they go out. It's like that's what they do. And they also support the country. Nothing happens without China, and I'm sure that China's playing a big role here. Certainly, President Moon of South Korea is playing an enormous role because he understands the mentality of the North, he understands the mentality of his people, where the respect comes from.
But when the president canceled the meeting, right, he wasn't informed. He didn't get a heads up.
No, he did it, and I'm sure he was very angry about that, but he saved the day, didn't he? He went there, and that was the most interesting thing of the whole thing. I've never seen a North Korean so nervous in my entire life. Kim Jong-un was very, very nervous. He needs this meeting. And Moon found a way to pacify everything because he understands Donald Trump and he understands Kim.
Does President Trump get some credit for pacifying the North Koreans on this day by making sure that Vice President Pence and National Security Advisor John Bolton, who had both talked about the Libyan model, they were not part of that meeting?
Well, that's a very smart move, and I think we will see a lot of them because there's good cop and bad cop. Keep the bad cops away when the good cop, meaning Donald Trump, is there trying to raise the ego of Kim by bringing his emissary to see the great emperor.
Martin Himmel, international security analyst. Martin, great stuff as always. Thanks for coming in. We appreciate it. Still ahead, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the clashes in Gaza on this day were lighter than usual, but still a 21-year-old Palestinian woman was killed. Dozens of other demonstrators were hurt.
Plus, there are new details about the Iranian troops being asked to withdraw from the Israel-Syria border. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this was another bloody day in Gaza. During Friday protest, a 21-year-old Palestinian woman was killed.
According to Palestinian media, she was working as a volunteer paramedic when she was shot. This was the 10th straight Friday of clashes between Palestinian demonstrators and Israeli security forces. Protesters gathered in 5 different locations along the Gaza border fence. Nearly 100 Palestinians were injured. Our senior defense correspondent Shai Ben-Ari has more.
It's another eventful day here on the Israel-Gaza border with some 3,000 Palestinian protesters gathering at 5 different locations along the frontier to clash with Israeli forces also positioned along the border. At the location where we were at, we could spot over 1,000, perhaps more than that, gathered there. We saw a lot of use of tear gas. We could feel it ourselves. There was also some live fire that we could hear being used by the Israeli forces. The Palestinian protesters burning a lot of tires, and we could see the younger people really dashing forward to clash with the Israeli forces there. Palestinian reports, including the Palestinian Health Ministry, noted that there was one casualty as a result of today's events, a 21-year-old female paramedic who was shot dead, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, further south from here in the area of Khan Yunis. The Israeli army noting 2 serious incidents from their perspective, including one case of gunfire being identified towards an Israeli jeep, and another case of a Palestinian protester throwing a grenade which exploded on the Israeli side of the fence. No injuries as a result of that. In terms of the scale of the protest today, it was still smaller than the more violent days that we've seen in the recent weeks. We do expect perhaps a larger protest to develop next week on June 5th, which is a commemorative date where the Palestinians mark the anniversary of the 6-day war, in which Israel, of course, captured the Gaza Strip as well as the West Bank. We'll keep you updated on these events, of course. Shai Ben-Ari, the Israel-Gaza border, I24NEWS.
The violence between Palestinians in Gaza and Israeli security forces took center stage on this day at the United Nations.
2 rival resolutions aiming to assign blame to either party failed to bring the Security Council together.
For more, let's bring in our senior diplomatic correspondent, Nina Larson, who's at the UN. And Nina, this meeting was supposed to be a vote on a Kuwaiti initiative to protect civilians in Gaza, but the United States decided to deliver its own version. What happened in the showdown?
Yeah, it was a showdown, David. All I can tell you is the United Nations is meant to diffuse tensions, but here today it was quite the opposite, and it was all about assigning blame. It's almost like the Security Council has lost focus on trying to deal with the violence on the ground. This instead became an issue about 2 rival resolutions, one by Kuwait trying to all-out blame Israel, and the other one by the United States trying to assign a blame to Hamas. Needless to say, neither resolution passed, and there were a lot of abstentions from powers that would normally side with the United States, quite frankly, on this kind of issue. that just could not find any kind of common ground between these two documents.
So the U.S. version, Nina, was not supported by several Security Council powers?
That's right. So the United Kingdom abstained from both versions, and France, actually usually a close ally of the United States in these kind of matters and in other matters on the world stage, actually voted against the U.S. resolution and supported the Kuwaiti one. So there you have. I wouldn't say it's an absolute 50-50 split, but a lot of the powers were very uncomfortable with the U.S. version. This was something that Nikki Haley brought in at the 11th hour when it was clear that the U.S. was going to be forced into vetoing the Kuwaiti resolution because they completely admitted Hamas.
Nina, Russia has reportedly called on Iranian forces to pull back from southern Syria close to the Israeli border. How is that going over? What's been the reaction among the diplomatic community to that development?
Well, we haven't really had much today. This is a strange day at the United Nations because Russia has just today taken over the presidency for the whole month of June. Syria will be discussed in detail next Tuesday, David. The focus was very much on the Gaza issue today. But just from reports, as you said, Netanyahu and Putin spoke on the phone. There appears to be a new understanding between Israel and Moscow on the Iranian question in Syria. Also, Israel's defense minister was in Moscow meeting his Russian counterpart. And media reports are saying that Israel has essentially been given the green light by Russia to hit any Iranian targets. So it looks like no one wants Iran in Syria at this point. And President Assad, of course, gave one of his usual interviews a couple of days ago, denying any Iranian military presence in Syria at all.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, reporting from the United Nations. Nina, thank you.
And for more on that, we're joined by JJ Goldberg here on set, editor-at-large of The Forward. JJ, let's start from where Nina just stopped, this report from a Saudi newspaper. How are you reading this report? Could it be that Russia actually gave Israel a green light to act against Iranian forces in southern Syria?
Well, the Saudis are saying that, but it's not clear that anybody else is saying that. What we do know is that President Putin in Russia came out publicly and said there's no reason for Iran to have any military presence in Syria. That's pretty huge. The Assad, the president of Syria, has agreed to have his troops be on the border with Israel, which is fine for Israel because they've been there for 50 years and there hasn't been incidents on the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. Syria's been pretty good at observing the ceasefires going back to the 70s. And that means that the Iranians, Hezbollah, and the various Shiite militias that Iran brought in are going to move a good 25 miles, 40 kilometers minimum away from, for starters, and they've begun moving. Today they began moving out of the way, away from the border and back behind the 25-mile line. And then the talks begin about whether to get them out of Syria altogether.
So this is a huge breakthrough, particularly for Israel and everybody who wanted those Iranian forces further away from the border.
It is a gigantic breakthrough for Israel. It's a tremendous step forward in Israeli-Russian relations. I think it's an embarrassment for the United States, which used to be in charge of the region. And now Russia is making the rules and calling the shots.
We're seeing Netanyahu and Putin engaging in a lot of talks recently, right? Very intense. There are meetings as well. I think it was you who told me that Netanyahu met with Putin over the last 2 years more than he met with both President Trump and Obama. But usually it's different because we usually see the Russians taking the Arab countries' sides over at the expense of their relations with Israel, right?
Well, there is some talk about the Russians are just tired of the Iranians. They're radical. They are troublemakers. Russia has an interest in peace along the northern fringe of the Muslim world because it's got a lot of contact and a lot of citizens, regions that are Muslim. They don't want them stirred up. And the Iranians have proven themselves to be nothing but troublemakers.
Is it also, I mean, look, and I wonder if, I mean, this is also a huge setback there for the Iranians, an embarrassment for them. Is it possible the Russians were moved to do this because the Israeli military, I mean, really dominated the Iranian forces a couple weeks ago when Iran fired some missiles that were largely ineffective in going into Israel, and then Israel bombed the hell out of some 35 different Iranian locations in Syria?
Well, I don't think it's not a big surprise that Israel has a good military. Right. What is interesting is that Iran has apparently been trying to heat up the Gaza border. That firing of missiles and mortar shells on Tuesday along the Gaza border, it's initiated and mainly conducted by Islamic Jihad, which is a small radical group that's loosely allied with Hamas and not very well disciplined, and they were dragging in Hamas into the confrontation, which Hamas doesn't want. Hamas doesn't have much of an ability to restrain the radical groups in Gaza right now because it's so weakened by the hunger. People are angry at it.
So in other words, Iran backing off in southern Syria, but perhaps stepping on the accelerator a little bit as far as their influence in Gaza.
It's pretty clear that Iran was behind the Islamic Jihad opening fire, trying to distract attention and maybe pressure from themselves on the northern front.
But Iran has made a massive investment in Syria. Do you think they're ready to just abandon their presence there?
Well, they won't be happy about it, no. The question is, can they stand up to Russia, and how hard will Russia push?
And how gradually probably this will happen. Let's just talk 1 second about the Gaza protest, because we're seeing that ever since the day of the moving of the U.S. Embassy, these protests are sort of dying down. Less and less people show up. Of course, it's also related to the fact that it's the month of Ramadan now. But do you think that the IDF's fierce response against the mortars fired from Gaza had some sort of an influence on that?
No question about it. Egypt stepped in and pressured Hamas and Islamic Jihad to accept a ceasefire. They had wanted a ceasefire with conditions that Israel commit itself not to attack Gaza at all. No assassinations, no preemptive strikes. Israel wouldn't agree to any kind of deal. They said, we'll stop fire if you stop fire. The Egyptians got that. Hamas was relieved. Islamic Jihad was humiliated, and Iran was once again humiliated.
And meanwhile, the status quo continues at the United Nations, with the UN body unable to do essentially anything. And I would imagine that Israel is fine with that, and maybe the Iranians as well.
Israel... The United Nations has not really done anything constructive in the Middle East in 50 years, since 1967. It should be noted that on the same day, the United States vetoes any proposed action by the Security Council against Israel. So the Security Council talks and talks and has never done anything. Today, they imposed new sanctions on South Sudan.
Let's be a bit more cynical. Syria took over the presidency of the UN's conference on disarmament in Geneva. Yes, earlier this week. This also happened. JJ Goldberg, editor-at-large at The Forward. Thank you for joining us. And still ahead on Crossroads, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been accused of spying on top generals in the Israeli military and leaders of the Mossad intelligence agency.
Plus, Mr. Netanyahu's wife is facing accusations of her own that she assaulted one of her husband's top aides. Crossroads continues after this. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has had a string of political and foreign policy victories in recent weeks, is facing new accusations of misconduct. He is denying allegations that he spied on his top army and intelligence chiefs.
Meanwhile, Netanyahu's wife, Sarah, finds herself in some hot water as well. Diplomatic correspondent Eli Hochenberg reports.
The Netanyahu's under fire again, and they're hitting back again.
A new bombshell report came out yesterday. This is a certain program that claims to present facts, and it claims I told the former head of the Shin Bet to wiretap the IDF chief of staff and the head of the Mossad. There is just one problem with that. It is a complete lie.
So this is what triggered it all. In an explosive interview on Israel's investigative show Uvda, the former head of the Mossad, Tamir Pardo, was confronted with this alleged new revelation that Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2011 wanted a spy to spy on a spy. This is what he had to say.
I don't want to believe that in a democratic country like Israel, the PM would ask the head of the Shin Bet to wiretap the chief of staff and myself. If he doesn't trust us, he could fire us within 10 minutes. To wiretap is the biggest mistrust that could be.
It took only a few hours for this bombshell to somewhat detonate, as not only Netanyahu himself vehemently rejected the claims, but also the former head of the Shin Bet, Yoram Cohen, the one who was allegedly requested to carry out the wiretap. This is not the only report putting the spotlight on the premier, or more accurately, his wife. Sarah Netanyahu physically assaulted Eli Gruner, the Director General of the Prime Minister's office. This, according to the Israeli daily Haaretz. Why? Because he wouldn't give her funds for maintenance and renovations of the Netanyahu's private residence in Caesarea. Only earlier this week, Gruner announced his resignation, but he, similarly to Mrs. Netanyahu, denies the report.
I have no words to describe this delirium of lies that have been continuing for over 20 years. Such orchestrated lies, so cruel by the Israeli media. The size of this proportion shows how small and unreal this is.
And here is perhaps the bottom line. In both reactions, Benjamin and Sarah Netanyahu are shifting the focus back on media credibility, or lack thereof. Recent polls indicate the public does not trust the media and does not trust politicians either. But in the case of Netanyahu, it appears Israelis are siding with the lesser of two evils. Ellie Hochenberg, I24 News.
He's been the face of Israel for 20 years, and yet controversy seems to follow him all the time.
Agreed. And despite everything going on against him and his wife in the investigations and these reports, wiretaps now, he had a very strong month of May. He's gaining a lot of support in Israel, well, due to developments here also.
Indeed. Still ahead, America's closest trading allies are threatening to retaliate in the wake of new U.S. tariffs on their steel and aluminum.
Meantime, there are new fears about the economics of natural disasters as the Atlantic hurricane season officially gets underway.